Hi, everyone. My name is Kim Lewis, and I am head of active ownership here at Schroders. Thought I might start out by explaining what active ownership is. So active ownership is what we do here at Schroders as asset managers to use our leverage as investors to protect and enhance the value of our investments. How do we do that? We do that by engaging the companies that we own on issues that we think will impact the long-term value, the financial sustainability of the business. We have 6 priority themes that we engage upon: climate change, natural capital and biodiversity, human rights, human capital management, governance and oversight, and inclusion and diversity, each of which we think are significantly material and essential elements of well-run, well-governed companies that will perform in the best, will generate positive, sustainable financial performance in the long term. So to us, diversity and inclusion is an essential component of a well-run company. So in order to do this, in order to engage our companies, we set very specific objectives for what we expect them to achieve, and we monitor their progress against these objectives. So I want to talk about how we would engage a company on gender diversity, right? In order to set specific objectives, we need to know what best looks like, right? We need to know what specifically each company we should expect them to do, and we need to be able to measure them against these. So we then have to ask ourselves, what does best look like for gender diversity? What does best look like? I should add that I'm going to use the word diversity, but diversity and inclusion we see as inherently interchangeable. They're 2 sides of the same coin. I know you can have the debate. Some call it D&I, some call it I&D, and say the inclusion comes first. From our perspective, they are 2 sides of the same coin. They're both equally essential. You must have representation and you must have inclusion, and one without the other is utterly meaningless. So I might use the terms interchangeably, but I'm talking about both. So in order to understand what good looks like in diversity and inclusion, we need to understand what it is for women. In the case of gender diversity, we also engage on other elements of diversity, but what it is for women that makes what companies need to do for women that will make women feel included, that they can bring their whole selves to work and perform at their very best without any concern that they're in any way impacted emotionally or otherwise by their gender. So what does good look like? What is an indicator of what best in class looks like for a company? So I had a feeling that there'd be quite a few women in this audience. So what I would like to do is to do a little research and use you for a little research. If you wouldn't mind grabbing your paddles. So I want to ask, and this is specifically for the women in the audience. I'm going to name 2 interventions, 2 asks that we generally have, 2 things that we look at with companies. And I want to know which you find more compelling. If you were looking at joining a new company, which one of these 2 things would you deem to be a better indicator that this is actually a good place for me? This is a good place for me as a woman that I want to work for, right? So I ask you to use a green side if you choose that specific issue. So the first one is going to be number of women on board versus female CEO. So for those of you, so you have one company with a high percentage of women on the board, and the other percentage of women other company has a female CEO. Could you put your paddles up, your green side, if you would find the number of women on board more compelling? Okay, and female CEO? Interesting. Okay, I'd say about 75-25. The other one, maternity leave policy, generous maternity leave policy, or a strong flexible working policy. Those who would say maternity leave, generous maternity leave policy, raise your hand, raise your paddle. Okay, and those that would say flexible working. Oh, really interesting. Okay, thank you. Third one, positive employee satisfaction survey for women. So, the focus surveys, employee engagement surveys. So high, strong numbers for women responders to employee engagement surveys versus internal women's network, a women's affinity group. So positive employee satisfaction, please raise your hand, raise your paddle. Okay, and internal women's network. Okay, that's quite close actually for those that you can't see. That's sort of 60-40. And the last one is the strong gender pay gap, I should say a small gender pay gap, versus long-term ambitious diversity targets. So numbers, stretching targets for numbers of women throughout the organization in leadership positions. Low gender pay gap. That's also very interesting. And ambitious diversity targets. That one was probably 50-50. So thank you very much for answering these questions. And the reason why, I think what these show, and I was hoping that they would demonstrate our point, that there is actually no specific answer to what women want. Historically, in our field of asset managers, we have tried to answer that question. There are 3 interventions that we have said as an industry are the 3 things that are most important to women. We've said board gender diversity, which is somewhat consistent with the poll. We have said maternity policy, which is actually completely opposite than what the results of this poll said. And we've also said flexible working, which is consistent with the poll, right? But those are the 3 things that we as an asset management industry have said, these are the biggest indicator of what women want and what will make a woman feel like the company they're going to work for is an inclusive environment. So I would submit to you that as an industry, we must take a much more inclusive, nuanced approach to answering the question, what women want. And the answer to that question is it very much depends. It very much depends on an individual woman. It also depends on where they are in life, their lived experience, and any other intersectional characteristic they may have. So I'm actually going to focus on, I was going to focus on 4, but I think I'm going to focus on 2 specific types of intersectional women. I'm going to talk a little bit about race and ethnicity, and I'm going to talk a little bit about age. So race and ethnicity. I'm going to start by talking about the US. Why am I going to talk about the US? Not for the obvious reason, but it's because we have the most data in the US about women and women of color specifically. In the US, any company over 250 employees is statutorily required to capture by race and individual ethnicity group, pay information, level in the organization. There's a whole range of 13 different criteria by race and gender that companies are required to capture and report to the government. So we have a lot of data. So that's what I'm going to focus on the US. So what do we know from the US? Pay gap. So in the US, there's Equal Pay Day. Equal Pay Day is March 24th in the US. Equal Pay Day is meant to represent the day at which women earn the same amount of wages that men earned the calendar year before. So by March 24th, women have earned what men made the calendar year before from January 1 to December 31st. Now, what the UN, now taking a more intersectional approach to looking at the issue of pay, there are now multiple equal pay days in the US. So in the US, Asian women, now this is the US definition of Asian, which is different than the UK definition, and that's a whole other conversation. But in the US, Asian women equal pay day is March 8th. So it's a bit earlier, a few days earlier than the 24th. For Black women, equal pay day is August 3rd in the US. For Native American women, it is not until September 8th. And for Latinas, equal pay day is October 21st. So when you think about how this one issue, this same issue, using actual data, you can see that this issue of pay has a very, very different impact for different women of color and different groups. And if our goal through engaging companies is to have an impact, or to have the most impact, I would suggest that you may want to start where the disparities are greatest. Also want to raise a couple of other points. We have begun to collect data, and PwC, I will say, has done some really interesting work about disaggregating data for women of color. Anyone know what's the lowest paid ethnic group of women in the UK? Close. Well, close in that Pakistani women are second lowest. The lowest paid demographic group of women in the UK is mixed race, white and Black Caribbean, which is really, really interesting, right? So, and then it's Pakistani, and then it's non-mixed race, Black Caribbean, and then Black African, and it goes up from there. So again, the importance on any single one issue we should be taking we should really be looking, if we want to engage properly and have the most impact, we should look at this from an intersectionality lens. I did also want to flag a couple of other inclusion issues. There's, particularly in the US, Asian American women, but not just the US, actually experience racialized and gendered form of sexual harassment that leads to isolation and results in exclusion from leadership opportunities. That's been demonstrated by research in the US, that's specific. So that would suggest that an inclusion agenda for Asian Americans would look very different than other, or should include other interventions than other women. And also in the US, Latinas, researchers demonstrated that researchers find that coworkers interact with them differently based upon stereotypes that they are unintelligent or illegally in the country. Depictions that often then require them extra work to disprove. So again, I would submit to you, when looking at the answer of what women want, what does inclusion look like for women, it could look very different for very different types of women. And that's why taking an intersectional approach to assessing what good looks like is critical. I'm going to focus on mention one other thing, and that's age, which Joanne also mentioned. Let's talk about menopause. Now, nearly 5 million women aged 50 to 64 are currently in employment in the UK. They represent the fastest growing demographic in the workplace. For the first time in history, women are likely to be menopausal or postmenopausal for a longer period of time in the workforce than they were reproductive. With women taking up more senior leadership positions and working longer, employers cannot ignore the unique support needed for women as their bodies change. There can still be a stigma attached to it and women's health more widely, and this stops women from talking openly about their health and affects their ability to seek and receive treatment and wider support. So there absolutely needs to be more understanding and acceptance of menopause and its symptoms. Women shouldn't feel ashamed to make adjustments. In the spirit of disclosure, transparency, relating to the stigma, that's why I'm standing up here on this panel with notes, because I'm in this demographic, and the thought of standing out there without notes and something to read absolutely terrified me. And I appreciate my team members who supported me with writing the statistics, and also everyone here who helped make this accommodation. It made a lot of difference for me. So it's just the point about being conscious about how things can impact different people in different groups. And sometimes there's some very simple interventions that can make a tremendous difference from people if you're in an environment where people feel open and comfortable about having a safe space to express these, particularly for non-visible characteristics. And so I also want to say that because 10% of women are now leaving in the ages of 50 to 64, are leaving the workforce because of menopause. So conversations about women supporting women in the workplace often focus on, as I mentioned, maternity leave is a huge one, but I would submit that, particularly given the changing demographics within the workplace, age-wise, of women, that is a group that we should think about much more. And there has been tremendous progress in this respect. So I could talk about other groups. I think Joanne so cogently mentioned LGBT, one subset of LGBT issues. I was also going to talk a bit about neurodiversity. There's some really interesting research there. You'll have to invite me back to talk about that. But what I did want to say is good news. Good news is that we really are making progress in these areas. I would submit to you that 5 years ago, this event and this stage would have looked very, very, very different. I'm encouraged. We're seeing a lot more research about intersectionality of women and other demographic characteristics. We're seeing employers being very forward-thinking about these issues. And so we are making progress. And on that note, I will say thank you for having me. And it was lovely to speak with you and a pleasure to share a stage with you all.